We've been really blessed today to have Dr. Joseph Youngblood be our keynote speaker. Dr. Youngblood is the Vice Provost and Dean of the John S. Watson School of Public Service and former Director of the John S. Watson Institute for Public Policy at Thomas Edison State University. And Dr. Youngblood also serves as a policy advisor to the New Jersey Urban Mayors Association. That was a lot to say, wasn't it? And that's just a tiny part of his curriculum vitae. Joe Youngblood earned his PhD from the University of Pennsylvania, where he was a Crawford Fellow and received the William E. Arnold Award for Outstanding Accomplishments in a Doctoral Program. And as a recipient of the Rockefeller Foundation's Next Generation Leadership Fellowship, Dr. Youngblood recently finished a 2-year study of American and international themes in democracy. Not only did he come here to speak to us today, but he brought his whole family. I want to call your attention to the very attractive lady there, or not you, that's his son. and his son and daughter who have come and graced us with their presence, and we thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Joe Youngblood.
Let me give you a word of the philosophy of reform. The whole history of the progress of human liberty shows that all concessions yet made to her august claims have been born of earnest struggle. The conflict has been exciting, agitating, all-absorbing, and for the time being, putting all of the tumults to silence. It must do this or it does nothing. Those who profess to favor freedom and yet deprecate agitation are men who want crops without plowing up the ground. They want rain without thunder and lightning. They want the ocean without the awful roar of its many waters. This struggle, you see, may be a moral one, or it may be a physical one. And it may be both moral and physical, but there must be a struggle. For power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. Find out just what any people who quietly submit to, and you have found out the exact measure of injustice and wrong that they will allow to be imposed upon themselves. And these will continue until they are resisted with either words or blows, or with both. Men may not get all they pay for in this world, but they must certainly pay for all that they get. If we ever get free from the oppressions and the wrongs heaped upon us, we must pay for their removal. We must do this by labor, by suffering, by sacrifice, and if needs be, by our lives and the lives of others. Good afternoon. It is a pleasure to be here this afternoon to offer you a keynote address at this very important statewide summit. I would like to thank Harry and the Citizens Campaign for the invitation to come to say a few words to you this afternoon, to the members of the board of the Civic Campaign, to the staff who've worked with me over the last few weeks in preparation for this. I thank you. It is most appreciated. Harry, thank you for acknowledging the wind beneath my wings. My wife and my kids are here today. It's a wonderful act of serendipity that Mother Nature ruined both of their tournaments this weekend. And so as opposed to dueling it out on lacrosse fields across New Jersey and Pennsylvania, they're here today, and that's a wonderful pleasure for me. So I would like to thank them for being here today. It's really interesting because the author of the excerpt that I started out today was the great abolitionist and orator Frederick Douglass. And it's really interesting because we talk about the contemporary realities and what we're experiencing now in America and around the world. And it could have been written just yesterday, but in fact it was written in 1857. But it is as relevant today as it was back then. Typically, when I use that excerpt to open a speech like that, it is really to pull out the inner selves of people, to draw upon the spirits of people like Yuri Kochiyama, people like Che Guevara and Cesar Chavez, people like Malcolm X, people like Edith Savage Jennings, people like Fannie Lou Hamer, who were drawn into activism not because they wanted to be leaders, but because they were sick and tired of being sick and tired. And so that aspect of understanding the core of who's here, why you're here, and what that represents means that I don't have to rely on the traditional rationale that I use for opening with that speech. Instead, I want to do something a little differently. So the opening statement, again, was from Frederick Douglass, and what I'd like to do is share some historical perspectives that will frame the genesis of what this speech is about, which is really, how do you determine the DNA, the genetics, and the architecture of a truly transformational movement? What does that mean? What does it look like? And how does it manifest in the work that you are engaging in as you start this process of taking what's happening now in these three cities and allowing that to be the yeast, the leavening yeast in building this loaf of activism and civic engagement across the state of New Jersey? So, critical point number one. This excerpt, again, was one of Frederick Douglass's most notable speeches. It was delivered in 1857 in New York. But a lot of people don't realize that that was 8 years before the Emancipation Proclamation. African Americans and other people from the African diaspora were still enslaved around North America and the world. But he wasn't talking about slavery in America. He was talking about the need to address the issue of slavery in the West Indies. So a really interesting point that I want to harken back to in a minute. The second interesting piece about this is that a lot of people don't recognize that even though it was before the Emancipation Proclamation, Frederick Douglass was a free man. He had made several attempts to leave the South and finally got out, and he went to New York, and he was in a different place. But yet his commitment was still to the issues. In fact, in many ways, it wasn't even about his issue because he was free. So a parallel translation is that for reasons outside of his own control, he had to leave the inner city. He left, he went to the suburbs, but yet he was still committed to the context of the people who were most in need of being freed from their bondage and from their oppression. Think about that when we think about the movement. So, across the span of this speech, I also wanted to really use extended metaphor to give you some imagery, some icons, some artifacts that you could use in your work as you move forward in the movement and in your work as a trustee. So, for example, a metaphor is basically a part of speech or a literary device that helps you use something that you wouldn't necessarily associate with something else. It's about a comparative exercise. So I first learned what a metaphor was as a third grader. I was at my grandmother's house, I remember it yesterday, and I'm saying, what is a metaphor? We have to do an exercise in extended metaphor. And my grandmother, who had an 8th grade education, said, I'll help you, I'll give you a classic, vivid example of a metaphor. And I said, okay, Grandma, take a shot. And she said, what a mighty fortress is my God. And I said, what a really interesting device. I get it now. That everything that God represents to you can be characterized in your understanding of what a fortress is. It's protective. It keeps people out. It helps to harness internally everything that you need to be successful when you get out. That's how we want to use a metaphor today. So the first point that I want to prove today is that Frederick Douglass was clear that the movement and the abolitionist movement was not about him. So that critical understanding and the first point that I really want to express today is that if you are engaged in these civic trusts and it is about you, it can never be a transformational movement. The basic reality in terms of why that's important for the lawyers in the room, those of us who had to take criminal procedure in year one, and you learn a lot about the rules of evidence, you know that the fruit of a poisonous tree is poisonous. So that aspect of the starting point in terms of what your internal motivation is for being engaged in a movement is as critical to the outcome as anything that you can possibly think about. So the end result for you is not necessarily about changing or challenging the legislation, changing the ordinance. It's about how you use the movement to transform the lives of the people who are impacted and who will be impacted. That has to be the laser sharp focus of what you're engaged in. It's really important because that means that there are other critical elements of the movement that have to force you at various points to continue to examine your heart, to continue to examine your head about what your personal motivations are for being engaged in a movement that's designed to impact change for a much larger group of people. So metaphor one that I think will be an important piece that you can take away with you. I tell people, if you want to be in a transformational movement and if you want to be a part of a transformational movement, bring cargo pants, long cargo pants, or a big purse to the movement. I'll tell you why that's important, and I'll give you an illustrative example. When I first started my work on the ground, organizing, doing work, education work with kids in Trenton, I was a newly minted PhD from the University of Pennsylvania. So I had an Ivy League degree, and here I was on the ground in Trenton. I discovered really quickly that the kids really didn't care about that. That what was most important to them is that I was there, I was committed, I was willing to do what was necessary for their positive growth and development, and that I had the competency that allowed me to be able to do that. That's what was important to them. So the metaphor of the cargo pants was that I had to make sure that every day I went to work, every day I went to a community action meeting or to a city council meeting, I had to have on cargo pants because I needed pockets to put all of my own personal baggage into those pockets. So I needed at least 4 because I needed 1 for each degree, right? I had to have a pocket to deal with my own ego. I had to have a pocket to deal with my own sense of the intersection of issues of race, equality, class, gender, right? Because I needed to be in a position to make sure that my stuff, my issues, my things were not impacting my degree of success in building conditions for success for other people. So that's a critical message and a critical point to take away. Another illustration of that is I would call the kids young men and young women because that's what I wanted them to be. That's what I believed that they were. It's what I believed they had the capacity to be. So one day we had an event at Trenton High School, and a young man came in and he had a fantastic haircut. And I looked at him, I said, "Young man, excuse me one second. Where'd you get that haircut?" And he said, "I got it at Razor Sharp." And I said, "Interesting, give me the address for that." And he laughed. And then he got together with some of his other colleagues and he said, "I think Doc wants to go to Razor Sharp." And so I said, "Well, for the people from Trenton will get this, right?" So I said, "Absolutely." So the very next day, on my lunch break, I go because I had hair then 20 years ago. And I walk into Razor Sharp, which is a barbershop owned by people in the community. It's on Passaic Street in Trenton, right? So I walk in the door, and after they realized that I was not part of some, campaign to make sure that I was an undercover law enforcement agent, I sat, and within 5 minutes, I was engaged and very much a part of the fabric of the traditional African-American barbershop experience. And in this particular instance, it was about politics, because everyone was anticipating the departure of Douglas Palmer, who had been the mayor for over 20 years in the city of Trenton, and the people were concerned about what that meant. Who's in the pipeline? How are we building and developing the capacity of the citizens of this city to make sure that in the absence of a strong mayor who is now transitioning, that we have everything we need in place to take this city to the next level, right? Well, it was fascinating on multiple points because 1 week later, I was at another event and someone said, there is a community-based leader that I think you need to meet. He's someone who is very much entrenched in the politics of what's happening, but also he has a connection to the youth of this city that you can't even imagine. And since you're working with youth, that is incredibly important, right? Well, I go to the meeting and in walks the guy I was sitting next to in Razor Sharp, right? That I never would have met if I didn't have the capacity to put my own identity aside, right? And his name was Darren Freedom Green. And so it was a really fascinating connection in terms of seeing what that means to the movement in terms of the connectivity that you need to have to the people you work with and serve as a trustee. That's a critical takeaway. The critical piece that you need to understand is that the root word of trustee is trust. That's right. So the aspect of understanding that it was not by happenstance or it wasn't serendipitously framed that you are a trustee is because other people are entrusting to you the right and the privilege to lead them in exercising movements that are going to effectuate change for the masses. That's the critical aspect and element of the metaphor that you need to take away when you understand what your role is, your commitment to, and your connection to the communities that you serve. Critical elements of how you need to function as you look at the next phase of your role in this trustee reality. The other critical point that I want to express to you today is simple, yet it's profound, I think. And it says, how can a movement be transformational if there is no moving? So how can you have a movement if there is no movement? I know that a clock can be right twice a day, but if it is not moving, it is not doing what it was designed to do. So with that, when we look at the issue of capacity building and its intersection with transformational change, if you're not moving as a movement, if these trusts are not connecting with the community and you are not having success, you are not moving, guess what? You aren't transformational. And you aren't supporting or encouraging or inciting transformational change within and for your communities. So the critical takeaway here is, not only do you have to focus on the successes that you have to also look at how the movement is impacting the very people who are driving the movement. If you are the same 365 days after you become a trustee, something is wrong. Because there should have been some growth, some development, some evolution across the span of that time because of your commitment to making sure that as a vessel of change, that you are committed to making sure that you are leading change, but starting with the self. So that critical aspect of taking advantage of opportunities like today, in terms of how you look at the training and the development that's happening here, that enables you to enhance your understanding, your tools, and your capacity for change is as critical to this movement as anything. It requires a deeper level of commitment to the issues, but also to the self. It's really interesting because Harry and I have started the process of creating a wonderful partnership, because we've recognized that there are inherent synergies in the work that my organization engages in. I'm one of the 12 senior public institutions of higher education in New Jersey. 43 years ago, some really insightful legislators got together and said, New Jersey has the highest percentage of non-degree completers in the entire country. Why don't we create a public institution that has the public values, because again, that's very different in terms of institutional context, to make sure that this population can receive an education, but do so in a way that frees them from all of the other encumbrances that you have in a traditional institution. That's why Thomas Edison State University was created. We have remained true to that mission. It is a phenomenal thing to see adult students who have been trying to get degrees for 30 years finally accomplish that goal and objective. That's why we exist. You look at the work that the civic trusts are doing, and you look at the work that this organization is doing, trying to build capacity. Well, we're working and cultivating a partnership that will allow us to allow the intersection and the outgrowth to create some unintended consequences for the people who are sacrificing their lives, as Frederick Douglass talked about, to basically produce change for other people. So as we explore these options, there will be opportunities for you to have some unintended benefits, that the purpose of your service is really about change. But if we can creatively find ways to increase your capacity, to knowledge build, to engage in lessons learned, and then to translate that into something tangible, like a college degree, a master's degree, certifications, etc., then we think, again, that's a part of this broader transformational paradigm that will become so important to the work that you're engaged in. A critical example of that, I look at some of the work that's going on in these trusts. I can think of a community activist in the city of Newark, and if I called her name, I know the people in the Newark Trust would know exactly who I'm talking about, but she's an unlikely suspect in terms of someone who has more knowledge about charter schools, more knowledge about educational finance and equity, even than Superintendent Cerf does. And if he were a smart man, he would be trying to find ways to get her into the administration so that she can execute now internally what she has tried to do so wonderfully externally. But that's, again, a part of this capacity building paradigm. You shouldn't be the same. There should be a different thirst, a different zeal for translating what it is that you're doing and experiencing on the ground into things that allow you to benefit and to continue to benefit the community. Similar illustration would be, I know some colleagues in Trenton who are community activists who can teach a class at Wharton on municipal finance because they understand the city budget better than the city council does, right? So that aspect of, again, understanding that there are these unintended consequences when you are in service for the right reason, there is a benefit to it. That's why we created New Jersey's first school of public service, because we understood that people were not devoted to building the capacity of the public service sector, the people who provide, every possible service that speaks to the quality of life that we deserve as New Jersey citizens. That's the emphasis. That's what you have the opportunity to do here when you look at the next phase of the work that you're doing here with the trust in these various cities. The second metaphor that I really wanted to fold into the equation is that the transformational movement is like jazz, right? It's beautiful, but it's non-traditional. It's non-conventional. It breaks all of the rules. And every now and then, even the drummer gets to lead in a song, right? So as trustees, you have to make sure that you are burdening the responsibility of building capacity, not just in yourselves, but in other people, everyone that you touch in the context of this movement. It shouldn't always be the usual suspects who are playing the usual roles. Shouldn't always be the usual people who have been appointed or anointed as leaders. We should be building capacity so that we can look anywhere within the movement, anywhere within the community, to make sure that there are people who can step up and lead certain aspects of the movement. Doesn't always happen. But what it means is that the people who are conscious have to be critical consumers of their own personal advocacy and activism. Well, what do I mean by that? Was meeting recently. I'm on a hospital board in Trenton. In fact, I'm chair of the board, and we were meeting with our auditors, and we're preparing to go through that process. And the audit team said, "We want you to know, Dr. Youngblood, we like you, but our role is really to be professional skeptics. So we're going to believe what you say when you self-report, but our job as good auditors is to make sure that we're looking underneath. We're finding evidence and data to support what we want to believe." Well, that's what you have to be as critical consumers of your own personal advocacy and activism. Framed another way, you have to begin to question the motives and the values of everyone and every organization that you interact with in the name of how you are working to effectuate and sustain change. Otherwise, guess what? People will misuse you. They will take your purpose, they will take your passion, and they will even take your pain for granted in understanding what that may represent for them. So that aspect of being critical thinkers but critical consumers is a critical aspect as you look at the next stage of really beginning to build this movement. I'll give you an illustration that again reflects this notion of how important it is to be a diagnostician in terms of who you link your brand to, who you partner with as an organization, and who you again work with across the span of the movement. That at the end of the day, if you are not careful, the movement and the inner workings of it will begin to mimic the same things in the systems that you are trying to dismantle and tear down, right? So that issue of diversity that I talked about, you will find that at the end of the day, you can take the same pathway and really become what it is you're trying to dismantle. I'll give you an illustration of that. When I first came to New Jersey, again, I was doing this youth development work, and I was really excited because I was also at that point working with Bill Watson, who was the head of the Watson Institute, in the development of the New Jersey Urban Mayors Association that at that point was still in its infancy. But again, it was a group that was comprised of every major urban city that you can think about in the state of New Jersey, some that I didn't quite realize why they were classified in that way, but nonetheless, they were still a part of the association. And as I went across these cities, I saw some tremendous correlative examples of what was happening in the nonprofit communities. For example, I would go to community-wide events, and I would see tremendous diversity. It was great. I would see people from all ethnicities, all communities, all ethnic groups, racial groups, you name it, class-based groups, etc. And then 2 weeks later, I'd be invited to headquarters. And then when I walked in and saw the central office, where was that diversity? Where was the central understanding of making sure that the people who were impacted, the clients, were a part of the formal business structure of the operation that these nonprofits were running? And who was there to question that? Where was the critical consumerism, right? That's a critical aspect of making sure that the movement is truly like jazz, because if it is not transformational. And again, you're barking down, I think, or up the wrong tree in that regard. So the closing point here today is that the transformational movement values every part, every aspect of the community. You have to, as a trustee, build trust within the community by making sure that you are increasing the capacity of the community to serve itself and to again make sure that it is a sustainable process that is building the capacity, the skills, the knowledge, and the understanding of the people who are a part of it. You have to advocate to make sure you are meeting the needs of the people in service of the community. That's the real work of the movement. So when Malcolm X talked about the fact that the movement would not be televised, he meant that the real aspect of the movement are the aspects that the press, the media, and the general public really don't even care about. That's the real aspect. So as a trustee, the familiarity that you have with your block and the block captain should be so great that you know that Ms. Rodriguez was just laid off, and that if you can assist her, you are assisting the movement. So making sure that her granddaughter can get to piano lessons is a critical part of the movement. It's the relationship building, it's the trust building that is so absolutely critical to sustaining the work. And then, folks, the critical aspect of that in terms of unintended consequence is that not only do you have a colleague, you have a friend, but you have a powerful agent in the movement because you have made a direct impact and investment in someone else's capacity. That's servant leadership. And that's the responsibility that you have as a trustee. And it's really interesting because when you do that, you have ready-made advocates who are there for you, who are ready and willing to move heaven and earth to make sure that the movement continues. So guess what? Call Mrs. Rodriguez to the next school board meeting when you recognize that the kids don't have buses to be able to get to extracurricular activities, and you got a ready-made advocate who will show up there and again be able to provide that voice from the community that's so critical to again effectuating change. So that's the perspective that becomes important. The third and final metaphor that I want to use is a really interesting one, and it's that the transformational movement is like a New Zealand mountain range. Interesting, right? I had the privilege, my wife and I honeymooned in New Zealand for almost a month. And in the span of that time, we had the opportunity to go from the tip of the southern island all the way up to the northern island of New Zealand. It's a landmass that is probably about the size of the state of Colorado, but it is geographic schizophrenia. You have fjordlands, you have the rainforest, you have wine country, you have mountain ranges because the southern alpine mountains run through New Zealand. I didn't know that before I got there. But it is definitely a bucket list place if you haven't been there. And one of the things that was fascinating is that we were at the height of the Southern Alps. And I was really fascinated because there was this wonderful forest in the middle of the mountains. It was so amazing that I didn't even realize that it was a mountain until I saw this huge gap in a mountain. And then you realize, oh, this is really rock. How do you have 1,000 years of vegetation growing? I mean, so I'm not talking about these little plants that you see along the roadway in Pennsylvania or in parts of New Jersey. I'm talking about a forest with huge beechwood trees, right? And I asked the tour guide, I said, excuse me, I have a question before we leave. Why is that huge gap in the mountain? And he said, really interesting question. It's because there was a tree avalanche. And I said, well, that's fascinating. Please tell me more. He said, well, if you didn't notice before, these huge trees and all of this vegetation are growing on rocks. Do you know how they do that? And I said, no. He said, their roots are connected. So literally, these huge trees have survived for thousands of years because they support and nurture each other. And the whole occurs because when there are parts of the, not community, did I have a Freudian slip there? When there are parts of the forest that do not want to benefit from the connectivity that the other roots share and experience and use as their point of survival and nourishment, then the rest of the forest finds a way in the first major wind to allow them to leave. And they do so by tightening the connection of the roots of those trees that want to be there. Metaphorically, you get it. I don't even have to deconstruct that one. But that's what this trustee group represents to the future of New Jersey, to the future of America, and to the future of the world. You should be excited to be a part of that, but you should also want to make sure that you are the right part of it. Thank you.